Okay, so welcome everyone. I know I said last time that I would try um, subscribe to the Zoom Pro. We could extend it to an hour, but the truth is extending from 40 minutes to an hour is actually quite a big monthly cost. So we'll stick to the 30 minutes or just above 30 minutes and hopefully try get through a few concepts, a few interesting concepts from the Parsha. So just as we do every week, just to give a brief synopsis of the parsha, we know it's the first parsha of the last book of the Torah. So the last book of the Torah being Devarim. This is the first parsha, also called Devarim, and this really is Moshe Rabbeinu's goodbye speech, or a set of speeches that he gives prior to him passing away. So the scene is set is actually the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year to the Exodus. So that would be the first day of Shabbat. And the Jewish people are now poised to enter into the land of Canaan. We know that Moshe has been prohibited, despite numerous attempts to convince Hashem that he should be able to lead the Jewish people into the land of Canaan. Obviously, he's prohibited. He's not going to lead the Jewish people into the land. So he wants to address the people. We'll go into a bit of the details. What was it? Is it a rebuke? Is it reminiscing? What really is the content of Moshe's speeches to the Jewish people? That he begins his address. Just want to mute whoever's. He begins his address by recalling the experiences of the earlier generation, so a generation earlier. So that would be, he speaks about the divinely commanded departure from Mount Sinai, the appointment of judges to assist in the upkeep of the civil society, that there's proper governance in place. He reminds the people of the sin of the spies and obviously the aftermath of that, resulting in the 40 years sojourn in the desert. He speaks then about the recent events of the generation that he's speaking to now, the generation standing before him. He speaks about the conflicts or the avoidance of conflict of Edom and Moab and Ammon. He speaks about the successful victories against Sihon, the king of Heshbon, Og, the king of Bashan. He again speaks about how the land was given on the Transjordan to the tribes of Gad and Reuven and half of Manasseh. And that's pretty much a synopsis of what happens in this week's parsha. But the parsha begins like this. It says, Eile hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the words that Moshe spoke to the children of Israel. Now, the most perplexing question is, who writes this? In other words, we know that the first four books of the Torah are divinely inspired. These are Hashem's words as dictated to Moshe. Moshe writes them down. Um, but Moshe is saying here, and it's written in the first person, the book of Devarim. Also, we don't have the phrase "Vayedaber Hashem al Moshe lemor," that Hashem speaks to Moshe in order to give up to the Jewish people. So we have the whole language changes. Moshe is writing in the first person. So is this Moshe saying things off his own bat? Or is it just like all the other four books where it obviously comes from Hashem, word for word, verbatim, and Moshe gives it over? So there's an early Talmudic reference, and it's actually the Gemara in, I actually forget now. Um, I think it's the Gemara of Megillah, but I speak open to correction, which says that speaks about the two different tochachot, that's being the rebukes, or the list of, God forbid, the curses that would befall the Jewish people if they didn't listen to the words of Hashem. We have one written in the book of Vayikra, in the Parsha of Bechukotai, and we have the other one in the book of Devarim in the Parsha of Kitavo. Now, the Gemara there says that the first one, the first of the Tochacha, was given directly by Hashem. In other words, Hashem commanded it, and Moshe gives it over. Obviously, Moshe writes it down. But interestingly enough, the Gemara says that the second set of Tochachot, which are found, as I've said, in the book of Devarim, was conveyed to Moshe, sorry, by Moshe of his own accord. So interesting. Two tochachot, two rebukes. The first one, the Gemara says, divinely commanded by God. The second one, in the book of Devarim, conveyed by Moshe, totally of his own accord, not through the word of Hashem. Now, again, that sounds difficult to understand, because again, the whole basis of a Torah that we subscribe to is that it's divinely ordained, comes absolutely from Hashem. Moshe is only the scribe. So what really is taking place over here? So I'll go into some of the classical thinkers, the Rishonim, the earlier thinkers of Jewish law. Rashi says, there's a phrase in the Parsha that says, Ho'il Moshe be'eret HaTorah, that Moshe begins to explain the Torah. Now, that's how Rashi understands it, the word Ho'il. He says that it means that Moshe began to explain the Torah. Now, Ramban Nachmanides actually differs from this. And he says that the word Ho'il actually means desired. In other words, it wasn't instructed by God. Moshe desired to give over this Torah. So Ramban Nachmanides would say that it stems purely from Moshe himself, and not from God originally anyway. The Sforno, also very famous, and I've cited him previously. The Sforno, very famous biblical commentator, he said that Moshe explained the areas of law concerning which Moshe, was worried about, that may cause confusion, that may lead to some uncertainty after his death. Okay, so that's what the Sforno says. Coming back to the Ramban, coming back to Nachmanides, it's interesting to note that where he gives his introduction to the very first book, the book of Bereshit, there he says, where he actually alludes to the last book of Devarim, the Ramban emphatically declares, and I'm going to read to you verbatim the English. He says like this, Ramban, for it is true and clear that the entire Torah, from the beginning of the book of Bereshit until the words Le'enei Kol Israel, to the eyes of all Israel, which are the concluding words of the book of Devarim, were spoken from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, directly to the ears of Moshe. So it would seem that there seems to be a discrepancy in the opinion of the Ramban himself. On the one hand, he seems to suggest that because he interprets the word Ho'il Moshe be'eret HaTorah, that Moshe desired to explain the Torah, he gives of his own in this last book of the 5 books of the Torah. In his introduction to Bereshit, he says unequivocally that we should never think that anything in these 5 books are anything but God giving it over to Moshe, and Moshe being the scribe. So how do we reconcile the seeming contradiction in the words of Ramban, of Nachmanides? We could actually find that where there's another commentator, again, I've referenced him before, known as Varbanel. So he says that the book of Devarim, this book of Devarim, which is causing so many problems, the words of Moshe, how exactly we understand it. So he says that it relates to laws that were of concern to Moshe, that would prove to be uncertain once Moshe passes away. And in fact, they had proved to be uncertain, and uncertainty had developed in the 40 years of the wandering of the desert. And Moshe wants to give those commandments over to make sure they're reinforced. So that's an analysis, if you like, that Moshe makes on his own accord. However, Hashem, according to the Varbanel, agrees with what Moshe has said, and instructs him to make it part of the Torah. So there seems to be a reconciliation that, yes, it does. Moshe, it is inspired purely from Moshe. He's concerned based on there's already becoming uncertainty over these 40 years of journeying, the interpretation of the various mitzvot. He wants to reinforce them so they're not forgotten when they're into the land of Israel and he's passed away. So he decides to go over these mitzvot. Hashem, however, agrees with what Moshe has done, with Moshe's analysis, and Hashem subsequently instructs Moshe to include it in the Torah. So it is still of divine origin. Um, the Orach Chaim, says that something quite controversial, and he is attacked by many of the other commentators. So the Orach Chaim actually says that we shouldn't look too much further than the beginning words of this week's Parsha. And the beginning words of this week's Parsha in the book of Devarim is Va'ele hadvarim asher diber Moshe. These are the words which Moshe spoke. These are words of Moshe. It doesn't say V'yedaber Hashem Moshe le'imor. Hashem speaks to Moshe and Moshe gives over. No, Eile hadvarim, these are the words that Moshe spoke. But he goes one step further, does the Orach Chaim, and he uses a common idea of biblical interpretation. And that is wherever a biblical paragraph or a section of the Torah begins with the word ve'ele and these, it comes to distinguish or differentiate with everything that had gone before. In other words, ve'ele, that word coming now in the book of Devarim, ve'ele, these are the words of Moshe. Meaning the words in the previous 4 books of the Torah were in fact God's words given verbatim to Moshe, and Moshe gave them over and wrote them down verbatim. Says the Orach Chaim, but this time in the book of Devarim, they are in fact Moshe's own words. Okay, so it would seem quite controversial what the Orach Chaim is saying. And the Orach Chaim has the suffix to his name, if you like, of HaKodesh, the Holy One. Not too many people will give it such a suffix to the name. So it obviously is an opinion that we really need to take into account and not just wave off. There's a book known as the Klei Chemda, and it was written by, sorry, the person who actually reconciles, or tries to reinterpret the Orach Chaim slightly differently is the Munkitcher Rebbe. The Munkitcher Rebbe was Rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapira, and he thinks that, or he says it can't be that the Orach Chaim is saying this, such a controversial statement, that the whole book of Devarim is Moshe's own words. So he says, and he actually cites the Maharal of Prague, who is then cited by the Vilna Gaon, to say that the text of the first books, the first 4 books of the Torah, Hashem, so to speak, placed the words into Moshe's mouth. Okay, so Moshe is merely the mouthpiece. Hashem's giving him the words to say. However, comes now the book of Devarim, comes now the last book of the Torah, and Moshe's role changes. How does it change? Now he becomes, in the words of the Munkitcher Rebbe, as he understands the Vilna Gaon and the Maharal of Prague, is that Moshe becomes a prophetic shaliach. He becomes a prophetic messenger. What does this mean? It means that Hashem gives over the context, Hashem gives over the message, but he gives it in a way that he moves back. He stands a bit back in order that Moshe should be able to interpret the words and give it over with his own style, with his own accent, so to speak. So he says the first 4 books of the Torah, Hashem places the words into Moshe's mouth. Moshe has got no individuality whatsoever. Comes now the 5th book, and Hashem gives it over, but he gives it over in a way that Moshe is able to add his own flavor to it and give his own interpretation to it. Still divine. So again, think about a God appearing to a prophet, and in this case, Moshe, the greatest prophet. He doesn't give him the absolute concrete words or ideas. He gives it to him in a vague imagery type of thing, and he allows that prophet, in this case Moshe, to interpret it and to give effect to it in his own words. Also, he goes on to say, and he uses beautiful imagery. He says that what happens in any type of communication between the person speaking and the person receiving, so the giver and the receiver, is that there's part of the giver being given to the receiver and vice versa. So there's this reciprocal relationship in the dialogue, in the communication, where each party is involved and each party is getting a little bit out of the communication or giving a bit of himself or herself. However, when it comes to the Torah, you've got the Torah being given by God, given to man. There can be no greater discrepancy in a communication than God and man. So what happens in the first 4 books, Hashem gives it over like a fait accompli. He gives it over to Moshe, the first 4 books, and there's no input whatsoever. Okay, it's like this divine God giving it over to mortal man. Mortal man, you don't have any right. You're insignificant in the eyes of God or compared to God. So I'm giving it over as a body of law to be untouched. However, in the book of Devarim, Hashem now becomes closer, if you like, to Moshe. He includes Moshe as the recipient. Moshe is now on the highest level. He's about to pass away. He's no longer just giving it over to mortal man. Not that Moshe Rabbeinu was ever just a mortal man, but now Moshe has something to give of himself as a recipient. So yes, it's still giving over by God, but it's given over in such a way that now the recipient has that which to give of himself, and that's how Moshe is able to give of himself to, in his words, to Devarim. Now it's interesting, this is just a thought that I had myself, that we know that after Moshe passes away, Moshe was the greatest of all the prophets, and after Moshe passes away, the level of prophecy diminishes, so therefore the communication with Hashem deteriorates or dilutes. And what happens is the direct communication, in fact, that eventually ends at the end of the time of the prophets. And Hashem allows rabbis to now dictate and determine law. In other words, Hashem creates a Torah, a body of law, and he's given it to Moshe. Moshe is disseminated amongst the Bnei Yisrael. But in his Torah, Hashem allows, not only allows, but he mandates that there should be a rabbinic authority. Rabbis should have the ability to paskin halacha. And perhaps that's the reason over here why Moshe gives of himself. There's a flavor, there's a time, there's a taste of Moshe in the book of Devarim, because that's giving effect to what Hashem always wanted. I'm giving you a Torah, but know that man's very much involved in the process of the Torah. Man, if rabbis have to be involved in making, adjudicating law, in interpreting, adjudicating everything to do with the law. By the way, I also thought of this when I was preparing the shiur, that when we speak about Masorah means the tradition handed over from the previous generation to the next generation. We often make the mistake of thinking that it's just a two-part system. Two-part system in that it comes from the previous generation and it gives to the new generation. It's not quite like that, because the receiving generation inculcates, absorbs whatever was given to it, whatever was handed over, passed down from the previous generation, but it's not giving it over in the same way to the next generation. It's now become part of that person. It's become part of that person's life and ritual and family life or whatever. So what's then being given over already has an added taste, an added flavor of that generation. So there very much is a third part involved in it as well, in that Masorah, in that handing over. But just to say, yeah, so there is, if I can just say to summarize, that we definitely must believe that all 5 books, from Bereshit to Devarim, were given by God, were divinely inspired by God. But according to whichever opinion of the opinions I've given, to summarize and to come out with that, the book of Devarim, yes, it's written in the first person. We don't have the phrase, and God spoke to Moshe, for Moshe to give over to the Jewish people. This is in the first person. Moshe is able to give of himself, is to give a flavor, give some form of interpretation. But that was all with Hashem's not only consent, but that's as Hashem wanted it. So it would still be, Moshe being as humble as he was, he'd still be that that empty vessel being able to be the conduit to the people of whatever Hashem wants to disseminate and share with them. Now, I want to go on to another vexing topic, and that is Moshe begins to give over, is it rebuke, is it reminiscing? And there seems to be a very arbitrary arrangement of the things that are spoken about. Also, we see that certain mitzvot are repeated in the book of Devarim, and it would seem that some mitzvot appear for the first time. Some mitzvot are given for the first time. And why would that be the case? Why would that be the case? So just to tell you what the Vilna Gaon makes of Devarim, and he says that the book of Devarim could be divided into three sections. He actually gives the chapter and verse. Just for interest's sake, I'll give it to you. He says the first section, which is from chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 4, verse 40, which would then encompass Moshe's first discourse, Moshe's first speech, if you like, focuses on Musar, what we would call rebuke or moral teachings. So in other words, he'd show the people, he'd remind them of the sin of the spies, show them where they went wrong, try get them not to repeat either their past failings or the failings of their parents who went before them. So that would be the first section. The Vilna Gaon would say that the second section of Devarim, that would be from the beginning of chapter 5 to chapter 27, verse 8 of the book of Devarim. This is where Moshe now focuses on the mitzvot, the various commandments that he wants to convey to the people. So what he would do, for example, we have it in Parshat Ve'et Hanan, he again repeats the laws. There are minor changes from the one in Yitro, but he again goes over the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments. Again, we have the first paragraph of the Shema, where he speaks obviously about the unity, the oneness of Hashem. And then he goes on to speak about the mitzvot, the obligations that will become incumbent upon the Jewish people when they enter into the land of Canaan, when they enter into the land of Israel. And some of the obligations would have been communicated before in the previous four books, while others apparently, and I'll come to that now why I say apparently are being introduced for the first time. And then the Vilna Gaon would say that the third section, which is chapter 27, verse 9 to chapter 33, verse 29, he addresses a nation with bracha. He obviously wants to give them all the blessings that if they keep to whatever Hashem has instructed them, only good things are going to come, only blessings are going to come. But he obviously also introduces the tochacha as well, as I mentioned in the Parsha of Kitavo, that God forbid if the people don't do as it is expected of them, then unfortunately calamities, bad things will happen to the Jewish people. He says something very, very interesting as well, the Vilna Gaon, and he says that in the first five psukim, the first five verses of the Parsha of Devarim, we have a repetition. We have what seems to be repetitive statements. So we have the opening words. It says that these are the words that Moshe spoke to all Israel. It then reiterates, and it was in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first of the month, that Moshe spoke to the children of Israel. And then a third time, within a matter of 5 psukim, it says on the other side of the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe began explaining the Torah, saying. Now, in the Vilna Gaon's eyes, this fits perfectly, because he's saying that there were 3 distinct sections that Moshe is dealing with, and each of these sayings, each of these repetition of the words Moshe gives over would be to give over each of these 3 different sections. He also says something very fascinating as well. And he said that each of the 3 sections, right, which I've just gone through with you, each of the 3 sections of the book of Devarim opens with the opening word of the previous 3 books of which Moshe was part of. Now, why I say Moshe was part of? Because obviously Moshe wasn't around in the book of Bereshit. Moshe is only introduced to us from the book of Shemot. But Shemot begins with the word Eleh, and the first of this section of Devarim begins with the word Eleh. The second section of the book of Devarim begins with the word Vayikra. Obviously, the third book of the Torah begins with Vayikra. And the first word of the third section of the book of Devarim, according to the Vilna Gaon, begins with the word Vayedaber, and so does the book of Bamidbar start with the word Vayedaber. So what the Vilna Gaon would have us think or want us to understand is that Moshe in the book of Devarim is giving over his shared experiences as he's about to pass away. This is 5 weeks before he's about to pass away. He's giving over their shared experiences, reminding them that he was part of their lives, of all their experiences over the last 40 years by alluding to the previous three books, Shmot, Vayikra, and Bamidbar. Um, Ramban and Nachmanides says, similar to what I've just said before, that Moshe focuses on the mitzvot that would be specific to the nation when they come into the land of Israel. He also says that he speaks about the commandments that would be regularly incumbent upon the nation as a whole. What I mean by that, so for example, according to Nachmanides, and he's 100% correct, the book of Devarim doesn't repeat any mitzvot related to Kohanim, the priests, or related to sacrifices. Firstly, it's not incumbent on everyone. And secondly, in fact, he says this in his introduction to the book of Devarim, does Ramban, that the Kohanim are punctilious. So they know their job, they know what they have to do. If they've told once, they don't have to be told again. Unlike the rest of the Jewry, who unfortunately need to be told multiple times in order that they don't forget. Um, Ramban also says that it can't be that the mitzvot that we think are new and being introduced to us for the first time in the book of Devarim are new. He says that these mitzvot must have been um, conveyed to Moshe during the first 2 years following the Exodus. And he says, why then is there such a delay? Why does he only give it over in the 40th year, just weeks before he passes on? So the Ramban says that it would be either because the fulfillment of these mitzvot are now only becoming incumbent upon the Jewish people now that they're entering the land of Israel, or that the commandments are not commonplace. So these are commandments that are not performed by the majority of the people. Now, again, he comes up with a lot of opposition to this, does Ramban, because again, many of the scholars say, how could it be that Moshe would have waited until the last few weeks of his life to begin giving over Torah? It makes no sense. And they furthermore discredit the Ramban by saying that numerous of the mitzvot that are recorded apparently for the first time were commonly practiced by the people in the wilderness. It's not something that wasn't commonplace, which is one of the criteria that Ramban mentions. And he says the other commandments, which, yes, may only have become incumbent upon the Jewish people upon entering the land of Israel, like the Jubilee year, like the law of Shemitah, was already written, was already spoken about in the previous books of the Torah. So the Avarbanel says that really he clarifies and he says that this is now weeks before Moshe's death. He's trying to just clarify any laws that may have become uncertain, that may lend themselves to any misunderstanding that's come about during this 40-year sojourn in the wilderness. And he says, there's Avarbanel, that no new law is introduced for the first time in the book of Devarim. I'm just mindful of time. I'm trying to see if I want to. Give me one moment. I'm just looking at my notes. Maybe I'll just continue just end off with this particular point. We also have the opinion of, and you know already by now that I quote him often, the great German scholar Reb Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So he says, in fact, that before his death, so in these 5 weeks prior to Moshe's death, he actually reviews with the entire Jewish people all of the 613 mitzvot. But he only repeats those laws which are now going to become more relevant to the Jewish people as they enter the land of Israel. So he actually gives an example. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch cites an example, and he says previously in the other 4 books of the Torah, where it mentions the festivals, it mentions Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, and it mentions Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeret, Shmini Atzeret. But now in the book of Devarim, where again the festivals are repeated, we only have mention of the pilgrim festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. There's no mention of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Shmini Atzeret. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says, why? Because all those others which aren't enumerated here are a relationship between man and God. Nothing to do with the land. Now, obviously, that they're going to the land, there has to be more focus on the pilgrim festivals, because the whole point of the pilgrim festivals were people went up to the land of Jerusalem 3 times a year. And not only that, but each of the 3 pilgrim festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, are milestones. They are agricultural festivals, and they link to the harvest season. So he sees it absolutely making sense. He says all 613 mitzvot were taught to the Jewish people by Moshe immediately prior to his death, but only those ones which were immediately relevant because they're now going to apply to them entering the land of Israel are now given over. Okay, let me just end with this. Why does Moshe choose to speak about the sin of the spies? If Moshe, part of Moshe's purpose, if his sole desire is to give rebuke to the people, then surely you're also going to mention other episodes that took place, not just the sin of the spies. You're going to mention possibly the sin of Korach and his assembly. You're going to mention all the other occasions, the golden calf, right? The greatest sin of all. You're surely going to bring that up. So why does he only focus on the sin of the spies? And the reason the commentators give is, yes, Moshe does give rebuke. And yes, Moshe does reminisce. But the most important thing for Moshe is to make sure that this generation now, the cusp of entering the land of Israel, don't make the mistake that the previous generation made, that their parents made. In other words, their parents, when they left Sinai, they got the Torah, were meant to go directly into the land of Israel, not go past, not collect 200, no, don't go past, just go directly to the land of Israel. However, as we know, they didn't. They sent the spies, the whole debacle of the spies, and they never went in. Moshe wants to make sure that now the people in the exact same position as their parents were, only now 40 years later, don't make the same mistake. And that's why he mentions the sin of the spies. In fact, the reason why something like the appointment of judges, which Moshe again repeats over here, is mentioned here, it's because Moshe wants the people to know that they shouldn't think that there was any external events or circumstances that caused the previous generation not to go into the land of Israel. In fact, Moshe says, no, the judges were already appointed. Why? Because there'd have to be now courts of law in place once they enter the land of Israel. So everything was already in place. The judges had been appointed. You're now going to go into the land of Israel and you're going to have functioning courts and functioning judges. So don't think that there was any external factors that caused your parents not to go into the land of Israel. It was only unfortunately their mistakes, their fears, their lack of faith, whatever hindered them at the time. And Moshe is trying his best as that loving leader, his parting words to the Jewish people. And that's why he specifically mentions the sin of the spies, because he doesn't want this generation to repeat the same sin. And think about it, they're exactly the same position, only 40 years later. They're now about to go into the land of Israel under the control, under the leadership of Joshua. And Moshe wants to make sure that this time they take the opportunity this time. They don't succumb to lack of faith, to fear. They grab this opportunity. And again, as I've said so many times before, Moshe really epitomizes the great leader and the great person. Sometimes if a person can't achieve what he or she wants, they certainly don't want anyone else achieving that which they couldn't. Moshe is the opposite. Yes, of course he's heartbroken. Of course he's upset that he's not going to go into the land of Israel, but he wants so badly that this generation goes in. He wants it. It's not as though he wants them also to suffer and to reach the same fate as him and to die in the wilderness. Absolutely the contrary. He wants the best for them. He only wants good for them. He wants them to into the land of Israel, not, God forbid, to make the mistakes of the previous generation, their parents. Uh, I'm going to just continue with this until Zoom cuts out, which is in 1 minute. But I think it's also important to mention that the Parsha of Devarim is always read before Tisha B'Av, immediately before Tisha B'Av. The Haftorah is Shabbos Chazon, and the reason being is because we know the very first Tisha B'Av was when the people cried. They heard the report of the spies and they cried. And Hashem said, "You're crying for nothing. I'm going to give you now reason to cry." This was the eve of Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av that time was established as the first Tisha B'Av. And again, so it's a reminder not only to that generation, when Moshe repeats about the spy episode, but it's a reminder to us as well, approaching a Tisha B'Av, that there have been mistakes in the past. We haven't maybe had the faith, we haven't maybe had the dedication in following Hashem's ways. Maybe we've gone astray. But we have the opportunity as well to see the faults of our own faults, to be able to see the faults of previous generations, and to please God not make those same mistakes, to please God be able to go forth, to go into a new existence, into a new reality. And please God, that should be that we shouldn't have to commemorate Tisha B'Av, but in fact this year should celebrate Tisha B'Av, and that we should please God have the ultimate geula, the ultimate redemption. Thank you everyone for joining, and please God, as usual, we'll gather again same time next week, 7:30 next Wednesday. Have a good Shabbos. Hope to see everyone in Shul.